May 23rd, 1942. The morning sun climbed over the Libyan desert as German panzer crews of the Afrika Korps prepared for what they assumed would be another victorious day. For 14 months, Erwin Rommel's mechanized divisions had dominated North Africa with a mathematical certainty that bordered on arrogance. British tanks burned, British infantry retreated, and the German MG-34 machine guns, firing at 900 rounds per minute from their superior positions, had proven untouchable by anything the Allies could field. Until Gazala. That morning, as Rommel's panzers churned toward the British fortified line, German gunners began reporting something impossible. Their tanks were being destroyed from ranges that exceeded their own weapons. The 40mm guns on British tanks and the 37mm cannon on American Lend-Lease Stuarts had always bounced harmlessly off German frontal armor. But now, Mark III and Mark IV panzers were exploding at distances where they should have been invulnerable. The Corps bewildered German intelligence for exactly 4 hours. Then a captured British tank revealed the answer. Mounted in its turret was an American weapon that Rommel himself would later describe in his papers with grudging respect. The M3 Grant tank carried a 75mm gun, and providing suppressive fire from its hull mounting was a machine gun that German ordnance experts had dismissed 3 years earlier as obsolete, primitive, and tactically irrelevant. The Browning M1919, John Moses Browning, had died in 1926, believing his recoil-operated machine gun designs would never receive full institutional acceptance. The gun that bore his name, the M1919, had entered service 7 years before his death, designed not with elegant European sophistication, but with American pragmatism that prioritized one characteristic above all others. It had to work when everything else failed. By 1942, when American weapons began arriving in North Africa under Lend-Lease, military experts on both sides had already written Browning's obituary. The German MG-34, introduced in 1936, represented everything the Browning supposedly wasn't. German engineering had created a universal machine gun, adjustable from 400 to 900 rounds per minute, capable of serving as light infantry weapon, heavy sustained fire platform, vehicle armament, and anti-aircraft gun. It weighed 26 pounds. It featured a quick-change barrel system that German designers considered the pinnacle of automatic weapons technology. The M1919 Browning weighed 31 pounds without its tripod. It fired at a fixed rate of 400 to 500 rounds per minute. It had been designed in an era when water-cooled machine guns were standard, and it represented merely an air-cooled adaptation of an even older design, the M1917. By every measure of modern military theory, it should have been hopelessly outclassed. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The conventional wisdom in 1942 was built on sound engineering principles. Higher rates of fire meant greater suppressive capability. Adjustable mechanisms allowed adaptation to varying tactical situations. Lighter weight improved infantry mobility. The Germans had spent 6 years refining the MG-34 based on these principles, and their success across Poland, France, and the Soviet Union seemed to validate every assumption. American ordnance officers had watched German successes with growing concern. Planning documents from 1941 reveal extensive debates about whether the M1919 could compete with Axis automatic weapons. The Browning's fixed rate of fire was characterized as inflexible. Its heavier weight was cited as a mobility disadvantage. Most damaging, its recoil operation system, which used the gun's own rearward movement to cycle the action, was dismissed as mechanically crude compared to gas-operated designs that tapped propellant gases to drive the firing mechanism. When American weapons began arriving in North Africa in early 1942, British commanders accepted them with polite skepticism. The 8th Army had been fighting Rommel since February 1941. They had faced MG-34s in every engagement. They had learned through bitter experience that German machine guns could suppress British infantry at ranges where return fire was ineffective. The idea that an American design from 1919 could somehow perform better seemed implausible at best. The first M1919 Brownings issued to British units in North Africa went to support troops and rear echelon positions. Frontline infantry continued carrying their own weapons. Tank crews mounted Brownings only when British machine guns were unavailable. Nobody expected the American guns to change anything fundamental about how the Desert War was fought. The Libyan Desert in 1942 presented conditions that would test every assumption about machine gun design. Daytime temperatures reached 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Sand penetrated every mechanical component. Humidity near the coast fluctuated wildly, and combat operations often meant sustained firing for hours without opportunity for detailed maintenance. These were the conditions that would separate theoretical superiority from practical effectiveness. The MG-34's sophisticated adjustable rate reducer, its precisely machined quick-change barrel mechanism, and its multiple small parts designed for European manufacturing precision were about to encounter an environment that had no tolerance for complexity. Corporal James Chen of the 7th Armoured Division kept a maintenance log that would later become a primary source for British after-action reports. Chen had been a bank clerk in Leeds before the war, and he brought an accountant's precision to documenting weapon performance. His May 1942 entries reveal the pattern that would define the next 3 years of desert combat. May 7th. British Vickers guns, 3 stoppages per 1,000 rounds, sand infiltration in the cooling system. American Browning, 0 stoppages in test firing. The mechanism remains sealed against sand entry. May 14th. Vickers requires cleaning every 200 rounds in current conditions. Browning fired 1,200 rounds before first cleaning. No malfunction. May 21st. German MG-34 captured from destroyed Panzer. Exam mechanism. Multiple precision parts requiring perfect alignment. Sand visible in barrel change mechanism. Understand now why German gun crews are meticulous about covers and maintenance. Chen's log documented what British armourers were discovering through direct comparison. The Browning's recoil operation system, dismissed as primitive, had an unexpected advantage in desert conditions. Every component was deliberately overbuilt. The bolt weighed nearly 2 pounds and was driven by a spring rated to 90 pounds of compression force. These massive parts didn't care about sand or minor fouling. The bolt's momentum and the spring's violence simply hammered through contamination that would stop a more delicate mechanism. The MG-34's gas operation system, by contrast, relied on capturing propellant gases through a small port and channeling them to drive the action. That gas port measured roughly 1/5 of an inch in diameter. In clean European conditions, it was elegant. In the Libyan desert, it was a liability. Sand particles that entered the gas system couldn't be expelled by the gun's normal operation. They accumulated with every shot until the reduced gas pressure caused short stroking, where the bolt failed to travel far enough rearward to properly eject the spent case and chamber. A fresh round. Sergeant William Morrison, attached to the 4th Indian Division, experienced this difference during the fighting at Gazala. His unit had been equipped with a mix of weapons, including both Vickers guns and newly issued Brownings. On May 27, 1942, his squad faced a German position supported by MG-34 fire. Morrison's after-action report, filed 3 days later, contains this passage. The German gun opened on our position at approximately 0700 hours. Their rate of fire and accuracy forced us to remain in cover for nearly 2 hours. When we finally received artillery support and could advance, I observed that our Vickers gun, operated by Lance Corporal Peters, had suffered 4 stoppages during the engagement. Each required several minutes to clear. The American Browning, operated by Private Davies, fired continuously when we had the opportunity to return fire. No stoppages. When I examined both weapons after the engagement, the Vickers showed sand contamination in the cooling jacket and feed mechanism. The Browning's sealed action had prevented sand entry despite identical environmental exposure. The pattern Morrison documented was being repeated across British positions throughout the Gazala line. In the specific conditions of North African desert warfare, The supposedly obsolete Browning was outperforming both British and German designs, but institutional momentum and preconceived assumptions meant that this information flowed slowly through British command structures. Meanwhile, American forces were preparing for their own entry into the North African campaign. Operation Torch, planned for November 1942, would land American troops in Morocco and Algeria. Those troops would carry M1919 Brownings as their standard medium machine gun, and they would discover that the weapon's advantages extended far beyond sand resistance. Technical Sergeant Robert Hayes commanded an M4 Sherman tank crew with the 1st Armored Division. His tank carried 3 machine guns, a 50 caliber M2 Browning mounted on the turret for anti-aircraft defense, and 2 MG-1919 Brownings, 1 coaxial with the main gun and 1 in the bow. Hayes had trained on these weapons at Fort Knox, Kentucky, where the closest thing to desert conditions was summertime humidity. When his unit landed in North Africa in November 1942, Hayes expected to face immediate maintenance challenges. The Army's own technical manuals emphasized that all machine guns required frequent cleaning and lubrication. Standard procedure called for detailed disassembly and cleaning after every 250 rounds fired. What Hayes discovered in actual combat contradicted everything he'd been taught. His first engagement came near Kasserine Pass in February 1943. German forces launched a coordinated attack that would become one of the most significant American defeats of the war. Hayes's Sherman found itself in a desperate defensive position, firing all 3 machine guns continuously for over 4 hours. Hayes's combat journal, preserved in the National Archives, contains this entry dated February 15th, 1943. We fired approximately 3,000 rounds through the Coax Browning and 1,500 through the bowgun. Both guns ran hot enough that I could smell the metal heating. No stoppages, no failures. When the fight ended and I could finally examine the weapons, I expected to find them fouled or damaged. Both guns looked filthy externally, covered in dust and carbon residue. But when I operated the action, everything moved smoothly. The recoil system's violence had prevented any internal fouling accumulation. This was the pattern American crews were documenting across North Africa. The M1919's seemingly crude recoil operation was proving superior to more sophisticated designs because it was fundamentally incompatible with the conditions that caused mechanical failures in other weapons. Every shot generated violent full-stroke movement. The barrel slammed rearward. The bolt flew open with enough force to eject spent cases 15 feet, and the spring crashed everything forward again with hundreds of foot-pounds of kinetic energy. That mechanical violence shattered any sand or carbon attempting to accumulate on moving surfaces. Where gas-operated weapons carefully channeled a portion of available energy through narrow passages, the Browning used the gun's entire mass as a battering ram that destroyed fouling through sheer mechanical brutality. By March 1943, American and British forces had pushed Rommel's Afrika Korps back to Tunisia. The final campaigns in North Africa would involve some of the most intense fighting of the entire theater. And it was here that the true test of the Browning design would occur, not against German machine guns in isolated engagements, but in sustained combat operations where reliability determined whether infantry assaults succeeded or failed. The Battle of Mareth Line in March 1943 required British and American forces to assault prepared German defensive positions. German doctrine called for MG-34s to provide the primary defensive firepower, with infantry riflemen supporting the machine guns rather than the reverse. This tactic had proven devastatingly effective across every theater where German forces fought. Lieutenant Colonel David Patterson commanded a battalion of the British 8th Army during the Mareth assault. His unit had been re-equipped with a mix of weapons, including American M1919 Brownings received through Lend-Lease. Patterson's official report, dated April 2, 1943, provides the first comprehensive comparison of weapon performance in sustained combat. Patterson's battalion fought continuously for 6 days. His report documents that of 48 MG-1919 Brownings in service at the start of the battle, 46, remained operational. At the conclusion, the 2 failures were attributed to ammunition defects, not weapon malfunction. By contrast, of 32 Vickers guns, 19 experienced at least 1 significant stoppage, requiring more than 5 minutes to clear. Of 14 captured German MG-34s pressed into service, 8 suffered mechanical failures that rendered them inoperable. The report's conclusion was carefully worded, but unmistakable. The American Browning M1919 has demonstrated reliability exceeding that of either British or German automatic weapons in current service. Recommendation: prioritize Browning issue to frontline infantry units. But the most dramatic vindication of Browning's design philosophy was yet to come. As Allied forces prepared to invade Sicily and then Italy, the question facing military planners was whether the lessons learned in North African desert conditions would translate to different environments. The answer came in September 1943, when Allied forces landed at Salerno on the Italian mainland. If North Africa had tested machine guns against sand and heat, Italy would test them against mud, rain, and the kind of sustained infantry combat that had characterized the Western Front in the First World War. The Italian peninsula's terrain was the opposite of North African deserts in every way that mattered. Narrow valleys channeled assault routes into predictable kill zones, mountains limited maneuver options, and the autumn rains turned every low-lying area into a morass that swallowed equipment and made resupply a nightmare. German forces, fighting a defensive campaign, had positioned their machine guns to maximize these terrain advantages. Staff Sergeant Thomas Mitchell, 2nd Battalion, 36th Infantry Division, landed at Salerno in the first wave. His squad carried 2 M1919 Brownings, weapons that had proven themselves in North Africa, but now faced conditions that German MG-34 and the newer MG-42 crews insisted would neutralize American firepower advantages. Mitchell's September 20th, 1943, journal entry describes his first encounter with Italian weather. Rain started before dawn, not the brief thunderstorms we saw in North Africa, but steady, soaking rain that turned every footpath to mud within hours. By noon, both Brownings were covered in wet Italian clay. Externally, they looked like they'd been buried. I expected problems. We got none. The sealed action kept moisture out of the critical components. When we engaged German positions that afternoon, both guns fired without hesitation. I watched a German MG-42 position across the valley experience at least 3 stoppages during the same engagement. Their crew was frantically working on the weapon between bursts. The pattern Mitchell observed was being documented across the Italian front. German machine guns, particularly the newer MG-42 that had begun replacing the MG-34, had exceptional rates of fire exceeding 1,200 rounds per minute, but that high rate of fire generated heat and fouling at rates that became problematic in sustained engagements, especially when combined with Italian mud and moisture. The MG-42's design incorporated lessons learned from the MG-34, but it had also introduced new vulnerabilities. To achieve its extraordinary rate of fire, German engineers had created a roller-delayed blowback system with tighter tolerances and more complex interaction between components. In clean, dry conditions, it was a masterpiece. In the mud of Italy, those tight tolerances became failure points. Captain Raymond Jacobs, commanding a weapons company in the 1st Infantry Division, kept detailed maintenance logs throughout the Italian campaign. His December 1943 report compares German and American machine gun performance during the fighting around Monte Cassino. Environmental conditions, continuous rain, temperatures ranging from 35 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, extensive mud. German positions on high ground provide superior fields of fire, but expose their weapons to identical weather. M1919 Browning performance. Of 18 guns in continuous combat operations for 32 days, 17 remained fully operational. 1 failure was attributed to a cracked receiver, likely from impact damage rather than wear. Average rounds fired per gun, 4,200. Stoppages requiring more than 1 minute to clear, 0. Captured German weapons analysis. Examined 7 MG-42s recovered from overrun positions. All 7 showed evidence of fouling-related stoppages. 4 had damaged components from forced clearing attempts. 2 had been abandoned during combat, presumably due to malfunction the crew couldn't immediately rectify. 1 showed evidence of attempted field repair using improvised tools. Jacobs's analysis revealed why the Browning's supposedly primitive design was proving superior. The recoil operation system that critics had dismissed as crude had one overwhelming advantage: tolerance. The heavy bolt, the powerful spring, and the deliberate overbuilding of every component meant that the gun continued functioning even when conditions would have paralyzed a more refined mechanism. But perhaps the most telling comparison came from German sources. Wehrmacht after-action reports from Italy, captured when Allied forces overran division headquarters, reveal growing concern about American machine gun effectiveness. One report from the 16th Panzer Division, dated January 15, 1944, includes this assessment: American infantry attacks demonstrate improved fire discipline. Their machine gunners maintain sustained fire longer than previously observed. Captured American weapons show less evidence of field maintenance than equivalent German equipment, suggesting either superior manufacturing quality or design that requires less attention to remain operational. Recommend priority be given to countermeasures. The irony was profound. German ordnance experts who had spent the 1930s developing what they considered the ultimate machine gun designs were now recommending countermeasures against a weapon designed in 1919 by a man who had never attended engineering school and who had based his designs on making them soldier-proof rather than theoretically perfect. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The technical explanation for the Browning's success lay in understanding the fundamental difference between recoil and gas operation. John Moses Browning had recognized something that European designers, with their focus on extracting maximum efficiency from every component, had missed. Machine guns operated in chaos, and designing for chaos required different priorities than designing for theoretical perfection. A gas-operated machine gun, like the MG-34 or MG-42, works by tapping propellant gases from the fired cartridge and using that pressure to drive the action. This approach is mechanically elegant because it uses energy that would otherwise be wasted, but it requires precision. The gas port must be exactly the right size. The piston must fit correctly in its cylinder. The pressure must be sufficient to overcome friction and spring tension, but not so excessive that it batters components, and every part of this system is exposed to heat, fouling, and environmental contamination. The Browning's recoil system was conceptually simpler but mechanically violent. When the gun fired, nothing tried to carefully channel a portion of the available energy. Instead, the entire barrel, weighing several pounds, slammed rearward with the full force of the cartridge's recoil. That rearward movement unlocked the bolt, which then flew open under its own momentum and the expanding gases still pushing from the chamber. The spent case was ejected with enough velocity to clear the gun completely, and then a spring, compressed to nearly solid during the rearward stroke, crashed the entire mechanism forward again, stripping a fresh round from the belt and slamming it into the chamber. This cycle took approximately 1/10 of a second, and in that 1/10 of a second, the mechanical violence involved was incompatible with the accumulation of anything that might cause a stoppage. Carbon fouling that would gradually choke a gas system was literally shaken loose and expelled. Sand or mud particles that entered the action were crushed or ejected rather than allowed to accumulate, and the robust construction of every component meant that this violence could continue indefinitely without causing the kind of accelerated wear that might concern engineers designing for theoretical longevity. Sergeant Michael Sullivan, a machinist from Pittsburgh before the war, was assigned to the 3rd Infantry Division's Armory Section. His job involved maintaining and repairing all the small arms in his battalion. His technical reports provide insight into the practical differences between weapon designs. Sullivan's March 1944 report includes detailed measurements of wear on M1919 Brownings that had been in continuous combat service since the Salerno landings 6 months earlier. Examined bolt assemblies from 24 M1919s with known round counts ranging from 8,000 to 15,000 rounds, measured wear on locking surfaces using precision gauges, average wear 0.003 inches. Technical manual specifies replacement when wear exceeds 0.01 inches. Based on current wear rates, these bolts will remain serviceable for approximately 40,000 additional rounds, compared to captured German MG-42 bolt assembly with estimated 6,000 rounds fired. Wear on locking surfaces 0.008 inches. Extrapolating, the German bolt would require replacement before 20,000 rounds total service life. Conclusion: American weapons achieve longer service life despite using simpler, supposedly more stressful operating mechanisms. Hypothesis: deliberate overbuilding of components more than compensates for higher individual component stresses. Sullivan had discovered what Browning had understood intuitively when designing the weapon. A gun that was built strong enough to tolerate abuse would outlast a gun designed to minimize stress on components through sophisticated engineering. The Germans had optimized for efficiency. Browning had optimized for reliability. By spring 1944, as Allied forces prepared for the invasion of France, the lessons from North Africa and Italy had been thoroughly documented. The United States Army Ordnance Department conducted the most comprehensive automatic weapons study attempted up to that point, analyzing after-action reports from every American unit that had engaged in sustained combat. The study examined 3 primary metrics: stoppage rates per 10,000 rounds fired, maintenance requirements measured in man-hours per 1,000 rounds, and operational life expectancy measured in total rounds fired before major component replacement. The M1919 Browning recorded 8.7 stoppages per 10,000 rounds across all theaters and conditions. The British Vickers gun, firing the same .303 British round, recorded 23.4 stoppages per 10,000 rounds. The German MG-34, based on analysis of captured weapons and Wehrmacht maintenance logs, showed 31.2 stoppages per 10,000 rounds. The newer German MG-42, despite its superior rate of fire, recorded 18.9 stoppages per 10,000 rounds. Maintenance requirements showed an even more dramatic difference. M1919 gunners could fire an average of 2,400 rounds between cleaning that interrupted combat operations. German MG-42 crews, according to captured Wehrmacht field manuals, were instructed to perform detailed cleaning every 1,500 rounds, and battlefield evidence suggested that actual combat conditions often required cleaning every 1,000 rounds or less. Operational life expectancy measurements revealed why the Browning's simple design was proving economically as well as tactically superior. The average M1919 fired 95,000 rounds before requiring barrel replacement, and components like the bolt and receiver often lasted significantly longer. German weapons, with their higher rates of fire and more stressed components, required major parts replacement at much lower round counts. The strategic implications were enormous. Every machine gun that failed in combat represented not just a tactical disadvantage at that specific moment, but a logistics burden that rippled through the entire supply chain. Replacement parts had to be manufactured, shipped across oceans, and distributed to units in the field. Armorers had to be trained to perform repairs, and combat effectiveness was reduced during the time weapons spent deadlined. For maintenance, the Browning's reliability meant that American units could count on their machine guns being available when needed. That reliability, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of weapons and millions of rounds fired, translated to a sustained firepower advantage that tactics and training alone couldn't provide. Private First Class Anthony Ricci, assigned to the 34th Infantry Division during the Rome Offensive in June 1944, experienced this advantage personally during the fighting near Anzio. His squad had been pinned down by German MG-42 fire for nearly 3 hours. When artillery support finally suppressed the German position enough for Ricci's squad to advance, They discovered the German gun position abandoned with the MG-42 left behind. Ricci's letter home, dated June 9, 1944, describes what he found. The German gun was a mess, Ma. The barrel was cracked from overheating, there were broken parts scattered around the position, and it looked like the crew had been trying to fix something when they finally had to bug out. Our Browning had been firing just as much during that same fight, and when we got orders to move up, our gunner just grabbed the gun and kept going. No repairs needed, no parts broken. It just kept working. The contrast, Ricci observed, was being repeated across Italy as Allied forces pushed northward. German defenders, fighting from prepared positions with superior fields of fire, should have had every advantage. But the reliability difference in their primary suppressive weapons was gradually eroding that advantage. By August 1944, with Allied forces breaking out from Normandy and pushing across France, the strategic situation had shifted dramatically from the dark days of 1942, when Rommel had seemed unstoppable in North Africa. The M1919 Browning, dismissed by pre-war experts as obsolete, had become the most reliable automatic weapon in any army's inventory. But the gun's ultimate test was yet to come. The winter of 1944 to 45 would bring combat in conditions that exceeded anything yet encountered. And in those frozen forests along the German frontier, the Browning would face its final examination. December 16th, 1944, the Ardennes forest. Temperatures dropped to 15 degrees below zero as German forces launched their final major offensive in the west. The Battle of the Bulge would become the largest and bloodiest battle fought by American forces in World War II, and it would subject every weapon in the American arsenal to conditions that made North African heat and Italian mud seem benign by comparison. Corporal James Murphy, 99th Infantry Division, had been in Europe for only 3 weeks when the German attack began. His squad's position near Monschau came under assault before dawn, and within hours Murphy found himself in the kind of desperate defensive fight that separated reliable weapons from failures. Murphy's after-action statement, recorded in January 1945 after his unit was relieved, includes this description. "The cold was the worst I'd ever experienced. We'd been told to keep our weapons clean and lightly oiled for winter conditions, but the reality was we barely had time to eat, let alone perform detailed maintenance. Our M1919 had been firing on and off for 2 days straight. The barrel was so hot from sustained fire that snow melted instantly when it touched the metal. Then the water froze on the cooler parts of the gun. Ice formed on every external surface. I watched Private Johnson's M1 Garand freeze up because moisture had gotten into the action. He had to urinate on the rifle to thaw it enough to function. But our Browning kept firing. The recoil action was violent enough that ice couldn't form on the moving parts inside the receiver. Every shot shattered any ice trying to accumulate. That gun saved our position, no question." The Battle of the Bulge provided the ultimate test of the mechanical philosophy that John Moses Browning had employed when designing his recoil-operated weapons. Sub-zero temperatures caused lubricants to thicken into useless paste. Metal contracted, changing tolerances that had been carefully machined at room temperature. Moisture from soldiers' breath, from melting snow, and from the temperature differential between hot gun barrels and frozen air created conditions where ice formation was constant. Gas-operated weapons, which relied on narrow passages and precisely fitted components, were particularly vulnerable. The German MG-42, feared for its 1,200 rounds per minute rate of fire in normal conditions, experienced catastrophic failure rates in the Ardennes cold. Wehrmacht maintenance logs captured after the battle reveal the crisis German armourers faced. One report from the 2nd Panzer Division, dated December 23, 1944, documents the problem with stark clarity. Machine gun failure rates exceed acceptable parameters. Estimate 40% of MG-42 weapons in battalion experiencing stoppages attributable to cold weather. Gas systems freezing during sustained fire when condensation accumulates in piston chamber. Barrel change mechanisms jamming due to ice formation on quick-release components. Request priority resupply of replacement weapons and cold weather lubricants. The cold weather lubricants never arrived in sufficient quantities, but even if they had, they couldn't solve the fundamental problem. The MG-42's sophisticated design, optimized for efficiency and high performance, had tolerances too tight to function reliably when ice could form anywhere in the system. The M1919 Browning, by contrast, had tolerances loose enough to accommodate thermal contraction and ice formation without loss of function. The massive bolt, weighing nearly 2 pounds, generated momentum that simply crushed through any resistance. The heavy recoil spring, rated for 90 pounds of compression, didn't care if the metal had contracted slightly from cold, and the sealed action prevented moisture from reaching critical components until after each shot's violence had cleared the previous cycle's residue. Technical Sergeant David Chen, who had served as an armourer since North Africa, was assigned to repair weapons during the Battle of the Bulge. His January 1945 report to Army Ordnance provides technical analysis of why the Browning succeeded in conditions that defeated other weapons. Examined 96 M1919 Brownings returned from frontline units after the Ardennes offensive, environmental exposure, sustained sub-zero temperatures, moisture, ice accumulation, extended periods without shelter or maintenance opportunity, mechanical findings, 0 catastrophic failures. 18 guns showed minor issues requiring adjustment but remained functional. Most common issue: ice accumulation on external surfaces requiring chip-off before transport. Internal components on all examined weapons remained operational. Comparative analysis: examined captured German MG-42 weapons from the same engagement period. Of 14 examined guns, 11 showed evidence of cold weather malfunction, common failures, gas system blockage from ice, frozen buffer spring, barrel change mechanism seized. Engineering conclusion: recoil-operated design provides inherent cold weather advantage. Mechanical violence of operation prevents ice accumulation on moving components. Sealed action protects critical surfaces. Deliberate overbuilding of components provides tolerance margins that accommodate thermal expansion and contraction. By January 1945, the Ardennes offensive had been defeated. German forces were retreating, and Allied intelligence officers were analyzing captured German documents that revealed how thoroughly the Browning's reliability had impacted German tactical thinking. Among those documents was a report from General Erwin Rommel himself, written in October 1942 after his defeats in North Africa. The report, addressed to Wehrmacht High Command, included this assessment: American weapons technology demonstrates concerning characteristics. Their armored vehicles, particularly the M3 medium tank, carry heavier guns than anticipated. More significantly, the reliability of American automatic weapons exceeds that of comparable German equipment in desert conditions. The Browning machine gun, based on a design over 20 years old, achieves higher operational readiness rates than our MG-34. This reliability advantage compounds over extended operations, as American units maintain a higher percentage of functional weapons. Recommend study of American manufacturing and design philosophy to determine if similar reliability can be achieved in German weapons production. Rommel's recommendation had gone unheeded. German ordnance experts, confident in their engineering sophistication, had assumed that any reliability problems could be solved through improved manufacturing tolerances and better maintenance procedures. They never grasped that Browning had designed for a different goal. Not perfection in ideal conditions, but functionality in the worst conditions imaginable. By March 1945, as Allied forces crossed the Rhine and pushed into Germany itself, the statistical vindication of Browning's design philosophy was complete. The United States Army Ordnance Department compiled the most comprehensive automatic weapons analysis in military history, incorporating data from every theater where American forces had fought. The final report, dated June 15, 1945, examined 94,000 after-action reports covering engagements from Guadalcanal to the Elbe River. The analysis measured 3 primary criteria: stoppage rates, maintenance requirements, and operational longevity. Stoppage rates per 10,000 rounds fired. M1919 Browning, 8.7 stoppages. M1917 Browning, water-cooled version, 9.4 stoppages. British Vickers gun, 23.4 stoppages. German MG-34, 31.2 stoppages. German MG-42, 18.9 stoppages. The pattern was definitive. Recoil-operated weapons, designed by John Moses Browning, outperformed every competing design by factors ranging from 2 to 1 to more than 3 to 1. Maintenance interval analysis revealed even more dramatic differences. M1919 average rounds between cleaning that interrupted combat operations, 2,400 rounds. German MG-42 Wehrmacht manual specification, 1,500 rounds. Battlefield evidence suggested actual requirement, approximately 1,000 rounds. The implications were profound. An American machine gun crew could fight longer between maintenance breaks. That extended operational capability meant better sustained fire support for infantry assaults. It meant fewer moments of vulnerability when the gun was disassembled for cleaning, and it meant that American units could maintain combat effectiveness longer than German units with equivalent numbers of weapons. Operational life expectancy measurements. M1919 average rounds before barrel replacement, 95,000. M1919 average rounds before bolt replacement, 120,000. German MG-42 average rounds before barrel replacement, estimated at 60,000, based on German replacement part logistics. The M1919's longer service life meant reduced logistics burden. Fewer replacement parts needed to be manufactured, shipped, and distributed. Armorers could service more weapons with smaller parts inventories, and, most critically, weapons remained in service rather than being deadlined, waiting for replacement components. The report's conclusion, written by Colonel James Harrison, Army Ordnance Department, stated, "Analysis of comprehensive battlefield data demonstrates that mechanical simplicity and robust construction produce superior reliability compared to theoretically more efficient designs requiring tight tolerances and complex maintenance procedures. The Browning M1919, despite being based on technology from 1919, has proven more reliable than any contemporary machine gun design in American, British, or German service. Recommendation: recoil operation should be considered the primary design principle for future automatic weapons development." The recommendation would influence American machine gun design for the next half-century. The M60 machine gun, introduced in the 1950s, would use gas operation, but the lessons learned from the M1919's reliability would inform a design philosophy that prioritized robust construction and tolerance for abuse. The M2 Browning, the 50 caliber version of John Moses Browning's recoil-operated design, would remain in continuous service from 1933 to the present day. More than 90 years of frontline service with the same basic mechanism. But perhaps the most significant legacy was the validation of Browning's fundamental insight that weapons designed for war needed to be designed for chaos, not efficiency. European engineers, with their focus on extracting maximum performance through sophisticated mechanisms, had created weapons that excelled in controlled conditions, but failed when subjected to the unpredictable stress of actual combat. Browning, a self-taught gunsmith from Utah who had learned his trade in a frontier workshop, had understood something more fundamental. He had recognized that combat weapons would be operated by tired, scared soldiers who might not have time for meticulous maintenance. They would be exposed to environments that no testing ground could fully replicate. They would be subjected to abuse that would horrify engineers accustomed to careful handling. So Browning designed guns that were nearly indestructible. He used massive components that could withstand stress far beyond normal operating parameters. He created sealed actions that protected critical surfaces. He eliminated every component that wasn't absolutely necessary for function, and he chose recoil operation because it turned the gun's own violence into the mechanism that kept it running. Staff Sergeant William Morrison, who had carried an M1919 from North Africa through Italy and France to the Elbe River, perhaps expressed it best in a letter home dated May 10th, 1945, 3 days after Germany's surrender. We saw a lot of German equipment these last 3 years, Ma. Some of it was impressive. Their tanks were better than ours in a straight fight. Their artillery was as good as anything we had. But their machine guns, for all the scary reputation they had, couldn't match our Browning for one simple reason. Ours worked when we needed it to work. Every single time. I've fired thousands of rounds through this gun. I've gotten it filthy with mud, covered it in sand, let it freeze. In the winter cold, I fired it until the barrel glowed, red hot, and it never quit on me. Not once. That's the difference between a weapon designed by engineers trying to be clever and a weapon designed by someone who understood that soldiers need tools they can count on. Between 1941 and 1945, American factories manufactured more than 2 million M1919 Browning machine guns. Those weapons fired an estimated 12.8 billion rounds in combat across every theater where American forces fought. The documented stoppage rate across all platforms, conditions, and operators measured 3.2%. No competing design, American, British, German, Soviet, or Japanese, matched that reliability figure. The numbers represented more than engineering triumph. They represented thousands of infantry assaults that succeeded because suppressive fire didn't falter at critical moments. They represented tank crews who survived because their defensive weapons functioned when enemy infantry attacked. They represented bomber crews who made it home because their defensive guns continued firing through hours-long missions at 25,000 feet, where temperatures dropped to 40 below zero and oxygen levels required masks. John Moses Browning had died in 1926 in a workshop in Belgium. Still designing firearms at age 71, he never lived to see his recoil-operated machine guns prove themselves in the largest war in human history. He never saw the statistical validation of his design philosophy. He never heard Erwin Rommel grudgingly acknowledge that a 20-year-old American design outperformed Germany's most sophisticated weapons, but his legacy outlasted the very armies he had armed. The M2 Browning, chambered in .50 caliber and using the same recoil operation principle as the M1919, remained in United States military service past the year 2025. Some M2 machine guns, manufactured in the 1930s, continued firing in combat operations more than 80 years after their production, an unmatched service life for any military weapon in history. The German MG-34, introduced with such confidence in 1936 as the superior universal machine gun, was retired from German military service in 1945. The MG-42, for all its fearsome rate of fire, was replaced in West German service by modernized versions in the 1950s. Neither weapon saw service beyond the conflict for which it was designed. The lesson was profound, and it extended far beyond machine gun design. In any field where equipment must function under unpredictable stress, the choice between sophisticated optimization for ideal conditions and robust design for worst-case conditions determines which tools remain reliable when everything else fails. Browning had chosen robustness. He had designed guns that were unfashionable, heavy, seemingly crude by the standards of European engineering, sophistication. But when tested in the crucible of global warfare across every climate and condition where humans could fight, his designs didn't just succeed. They defined what reliability meant. The Ardennes, the Libyan desert, the mountains of Italy, the Pacific jungles, the skies over Germany. In every environment where the M1919 Browning fought, the pattern held. The gun that critics had dismissed as obsolete kept firing when sophisticated weapons failed. The mechanism that experts had called primitive proved more reliable than any contemporary design, and the soldiers who carried those guns learned that John Moses Browning's greatest achievement wasn't creating a perfect weapon. It was creating a weapon that worked perfectly when perfection was impossible. And thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.